Uh,
So, Jane, would you like me to get us going here?
That sounds great, David. Thank you.
Super. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. Um, and thanks for responding to this opportunity to weigh in on some interesting work that's happening at state government in Vermont. Let me just say a few things about the meeting. My name is David Plum, and my role here is just to help facilitate tonight's conversation. And we're doing this on Zoom as one big happy Zoom meeting. If you're having any Zoom issues, just let us know if you're having a hard time hearing anybody. And thanks, folks, for, typical Zoom etiquette of staying on mute unless you're talking. We are recording this session tonight. We're doing another one tomorrow, and we're happy to share that recording with you. We'll also make a summary, and happy to share those summaries of the input we've heard. Tonight, we've got a presentation from the Climate Action Office, Vermont's Climate Action Office, to talk about what you can see on the screen here, that Vermont's opportunity for federal climate funding. And we're going to spend most of our time, though, tonight having a conversation about that and what that looks like for you and your lives. And before I turn it over to Jane to do the presentation, and it's actually you're seeing Jane, not Sophie, but that's exciting. But before I do that, why don't we just do one quick thing? And if we were to drop the slides, actually, just for a second, and let's do a quick check-in on who's here. And this is where Zoom's good because you can use the chat. And one of the things I thought I'd ask for everybody who's joining us tonight is in the chat, if you could just drop in where you're calling from tonight or where home is, whatever you prefer, what part of the state you're in or wherever you're in, if you could drop that in the chat. And when you do that, it would be really interesting, since we're going to be talking about climate change tonight and a changing climate. If you could mention something in the chat about how you've seen a climate impact your community or life over the last several years, what have been the pieces of changing climate that you've seen wherever you live in the state? So if everyone could just do a favor, at a minimum, drop in the chat where you're calling in from tonight. And if you could say a little bit about the kinds of impacts you've seen from a changing climate, that would be great too. So I'll just give that a moment to see some activity in the chat to know who we have and where folks are calling in from tonight. Let me just give it a moment. I'm not seeing it just yet. There we go. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, flooding, of course. Yes. Yes, flooding, of course. Oh, sorry, Andrew. If anybody has difficulty reading the chat, you just press on that little button at the bottom that says chat. And if it's not there, it's under the 3 little dots that say more. And then you can press on chat if you don't see it. There's lots of good stuff coming in right now, right? Wildfire smoke, flooding, great. So you have good representation for planning commissions. That's great. Thanks, everybody. I'm just reading the chat in the same way you all are. Yes, people's basements, climate change, and ticks. Yes. Okay, great. Excellent. All right. So feel free to drop if you haven't dropped in. Again, if you're just joining us, we're just throwing in the chat where you're calling in from tonight or where home is, whichever you prefer. And if you're seeing something change from a changing climate in your community. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to do 2 presentations. One is going to be about 10 minutes, and the other one is going to be another 10 minutes or so from folks in the Climate Action Office. And they're going to put some context around why we're coming together tonight, what this topic is, and the decisions that the state's trying to make around these federal funding opportunities as related to climate pollution reduction. And then we're going to start a conversation about it and get your views on it. So I'm going to turn it over to Jane Lazorchak, who's the director over there at the Climate Action Office, and she's going to lead us off on some context for this. And thanks for your patience as we work our way through these, let's call it about 20 minutes of presentation. If you do have questions as we go, the chat is a great place for those questions. So feel free to drop stuff in the chat if you have some questions. I'm not saying that Jane or Megan should be answering those in real time, but it's good to just capture those questions as we go. So Jane, take it away. Over to you.
Thanks so much, David. I felt like when you said turning it over for 20 minutes of presentation, it felt like a challenge to Megan and I to meet you in 20 minutes. He's nodding. So thank you all for taking the snowy evening to join us online tonight. James Zorchek, I work at the Climate Action Office within the Agency of Natural Resources. As David said, I'm going to just start us off with a little bit of context around how this opportunity fits into Vermont's broader climate goals and climate planning requirements. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Megan O'Toole, who is the program manager for our climate change mitigation work within our Climate Action Office, who's going to walk you through how we made some decisions to get us to the point where we're at today with what we're lifting up, share that with you all, and then really sit back and hope to have a rich dialogue with all of you around your ideas and questions to hopefully make this a better process moving forward. So as you saw, I'm working off of colleague Sophie's computer, so let me make sure I can reshare. Is that coming through okay, David? Great.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks so much. Now, if it would advance, there it goes. Okay. So we went through all of this already, but we really are going to try to keep this concise, 20 minutes or so of presentation, and then really want to provide the space for David and Sophie to share and facilitate a conversation with all of you, and really hone us in on the opportunity at hand, but also welcome questions from you more broadly about what our state's doing to address climate change right now. A little bit of context for all of you. The Climate Action Office is a newly formed office within the Agency of Natural Resources. The Agency of Natural Resources is one of larger state agencies in government, and actually is comprised of 3 departments: the Fish and Wildlife Department, Forest Parks and Recreation, and Department of Environmental Conservation. The Secretary's Office, which is a small administrative office above those 3 departments, is where our Climate Action Office sits. Our office works in service of lifting up and amplifying climate action within our own agency, but it has a much larger role in thinking about how we amplify, coordinate, and speak to the state's work across all of the state's agencies that have a hand in climate solutions. So ANR, while we have a big role to play, we partner really closely with agencies like the Transportation Agency, the Energy Office within our Public Service Department, the Ag Agency, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and think really broadly about how we address the changing climate and meet the policy needs of our state to stand up the work. The Climate Action Office was a direct recommendation that came out of the Climate Action Plan. Vermont is uniquely positioned in that we stand similarly with neighboring states, but really have very strong legislation around climate action that was passed back in 2020. The Global Warming Solutions Act took what was goals that had been on the books for more than a decade around cutting climate pollution, and they put those in statute and set Vermont on a path to cut our climate pollution in half by 2030 and then down by 80% by 2050. The law went a lot further to meeting Vermont's climate change needs and spoke to how we build resilience and adaptation in our natural and built environment. It spoke to cross-cutting solutions like investing in our downtowns and compact settlement for all of the climate benefits they provide, as well as our natural and working lands. To do that ambitious work, it stood up the Climate Council in that same fall, which is an independent body that's comprised of legislative appointments and state government secretaries and commissioners, and charged it with developing Vermont's initial climate action plan. That plan is robust. It's a template, a roadmap, you may call it, for Vermont moving forward climate action. And it informed and stood us up on the right path to taking advantage of opportunities like the ones we're going to talk about tonight. It also sets us on a path for thinking about how we implement the plan and meet specific obligations. And that really is the role of our office on behalf of all of you as Vermonters and on behalf of working with our other state agencies. So what's in the Climate Action Plan? It is not Vermont's first foray into climate planning, but I would argue it's a really robust, statutorily required plan and has a different weight, sort of gravitas around it that other plans have not had in the past. It's required to be updated every 4 years, and our next one is actually coming quite quick, July 1st of 2025. It includes more than 230 actions or operational tasks for Vermont state agencies, the legislature, and other partners like municipalities, RPCs, to actually address and implement climate action. It also includes a framework for how we measure and track progress and how we further invest in creating those solutions with all of you and really set us on a path for robust community engagement, knowing that if we're really going to stand up and meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, it requires cross-cutting solutions that are co-collaborated on and developed in partnership with Vermonters. So how are we doing? The plan is largely being implemented across state government. As I said, it's a roadmap. It's not only the actions within the plan that we're working on, but it's really a space for us to think about how programmatic work and actions across government complement and move us forward in meeting and addressing climate change. So this was really an opportunity. This opportunity around addressing new funding coming into our state was to review progress both in the actions that were in the Climate Action Plan, but also take stock and inventory of other work that was happening that was complementary to or additive to those actions, and really provide a space for us to check in on where we're making good progress, but where there's been little or no progress, and find ways to think about how we can move that forward with this funding as well as future funding opportunities. So we're here tonight. What is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant? The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant is one of the biggest pots of funding from the passage of what's called the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed more than a year ago by the federal Congress and signed into law by President Biden. It's an ambitious climate bill. It's complemented with other work as well, hence the name, the Inflation Reduction Act, rather than just calling it climate legislation. It addresses a myriad of issues at the federal level, but it provides a lot of unique funding opportunities for states, as well as complement tax incentives and other programs that will have come down through the IRA. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant itself is one of the biggest pots of money in the IRA for states to access competitively and really massage to meet state climate goals. So it's a unique opportunity for us to first inventory what we're doing and then really use this funding to plug holes and think about how we elevate and make specific programs that we're already doing even more accessible and more financially responsible for Vermonters to take advantage of. It's $4.6 billion in total. Vermont is likely to have about $90 million as our piece of the pie. There are different funding levels that makes you either more or less competitive. And based on our work with our neighboring states and across the country through relationships that Vermont has through partnerships like the U.S. Climate Alliance, we feel like it's a reasonable ask to ask for just under $100 million. This unique opportunity has to show measurable reduction in climate pollution. So while we know that comprehensive climate action has to do all of the things on the screen, cut climate pollution, reduce our emissions, invest in our natural and working lands for the benefits they provide, as well as think about resilience and adaptation, this funding opportunity has to have quantifiable emissions benefits. So AKA has to either show us cutting climate pollution or investing in our natural and working lands to sequester and store more of that carbon. How do we pull that down from the atmosphere? So this specific opportunity has co-benefits though, and if we do our job well in thinking about what the measures and actions are through the PCAP or through the priority plan that we're going to talk about with you all tonight, we will have lifted up actions that have co-benefits across all of these areas. Before I turn it over, Megan, to actually speak about how we prioritized and thought about actions in this space, I want to just set the stage for what Vermont's emissions look like. Where, in other words, where is our greatest opportunity for strategies and actions to be deployed? Our historical emissions are what are shown on the left side of this graph. What's shown not grayed out. We are able to keep up to date relatively around 2 to 3 years, the data lags. So our most recent inventory is from 2020. What you'll see there is actually a sharp decline from 2019. Largely what that decline is made up of is folks not driving as much during the pandemic. We were all at home, hunkered down, and so our transportation emissions went down for a year. How far that sort of stays with us, how those policies can transcend into the future, we'll see in the next year. But transportation is still our largest sector. We're a small state. We drive around a lot. It's hard to move besides in single occupancy vehicles. And so it's one of our areas for a lot of growth. Buildings and thermal is our second largest sector, how we heat our homes and how we heat our commercial and industrial spaces. And then unlike other states, electricity is a really small sector, and our third largest area is actually in our ag sector. We have a big ag state, and the way that we farm and produce our agricultural commodities actually produces emissions. It's also an area of greatest growth and opportunity for thinking about resilience and adaptation and how we preserve those lands and manage them more effectively. So just really quickly, what you see in that grayed out area is the projected decline that we need to do in order to meet the emissions requirements of the GWSA. It does not project that we're necessarily on that track yet. And these funds are a specific opportunity to help us continue to decline our emissions and help us meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Megan, please go ahead, take over.
Thanks, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, I'm going to dig into some of the details related to the opportunity that this funding presents to Vermonters in the state of Vermont, and kind of how we got to where we are now, which is creating a landscape of some bins of opportunity and funding, and then getting feedback from you about what specific actions you think we should be taking to reduce climate change causing emissions that will most significantly impact Vermont and take advantage of this opportunity. So I'm going to step back for just a minute and talk a little bit more about how we are prioritizing actions in the climate action plan that Jane discussed that are potentially ripe for this funding opportunity. And so some of the questions that we asked over the course of the last year, working with both state and external partners to review actions in the climate action plan for this particular funding opportunity is there funding available for this action now? So what state or federal resources may or may not be available or already being implemented to further a particular action? How will an action benefit Vermonters in an equitable way? So in particular for low-income and disadvantaged communities, will the action have detrimental impacts to low-income and disadvantaged communities, or will it provide a benefit to those communities? Again, just circling back to the climate action plan, how well does the action align with the plan and the charge given to the Climate Council adopted within that plan? And then how does the action help to reduce emissions that cause climate change? And as Jane mentioned, that's a really critical criterion related to this funding, because we do have to be able to demonstrate that the action will in fact reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So we are well on the way to reducing emissions that cause climate change in Vermont. We have a number of programs that touch all different sectors of the economy. Most significantly, and this meets the fact that our transportation sector contributes the most greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Vermont, we have robust incentives for electric passenger cars. We have weatherization and fuel switching funding available to help people make their building envelopes tighter and then switch away from fossil fuels towards electricity for home heating. We have municipal building assessments available to our cities and towns to help them understand where they're using energy and how they could use less energy and then also improve the infrastructure within their buildings. We have a robust electric vehicle charging network. In fact, Vermont has the most public electric vehicle charging stations per capita in the country. So we are really doing well in that area in terms of helping people transition to electric vehicles. We've deployed a number of public transit buses that are electrified, as well as electric school buses, thanks to a series of different funding sources, mostly available at the federal level. We've embarked on significant wetland restoration projects, mostly in the Lake Champlain Basin, but we are potentially looking to expand those opportunities throughout the state. And then we've invested significantly in helping farmers make transitions in how they implement agricultural practices to not only mitigate water quality issues, but also to reduce climate change causing emissions. So in order to answer the questions about where more funding is needed, as I mentioned before, we worked both within and outside of state government to determine where the resources are already flowing and what is being implemented. In the event that an action is already being implemented, where would additional resources help to further move the needle to reduce climate pollution? So many of the actions that we are already implementing today could be expanded in scale and scope to help further achieve our mitigation goals. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we know that there are many state and federal funding streams that are already flowing to address climate change in Vermont. So we also need to consider this particular fund's unique place in meeting Vermont's needs to reduce climate change pollution. Current funding is coming to Vermonters in the form of tax credits, direct payments from the IRS, grant programs, no interest loans, and rebates. There are often many types of funding available for the same activity. So these funds can be combined, or what we call stacked, to make an even bigger difference for folks that are looking to save money and reduce emissions from climate change. So this funding is designed to be used by states to achieve their own specific goals. This means that we have an opportunity to personalize this funding for Vermont's needs and fill gaps that can be met with existing resources. And I'm sorry, my cat always likes to come and join me when I'm talking on Zoom. So therefore, we need to look at all sectors of the economy and ask more questions about how these funds can be most effective for Vermont and Vermonters. Next slide, please. So digging into the sector specifically, one of Vermont's best climate mitigation features is our natural and working landscapes. So questions that we need to ask about how to harness mitigation opportunities in this space. How do we help farmers implement more climate smart agricultural practices? How do we conserve more land and at the same time create necessary housing? How do we expand wetland restoration programs that have significant climate benefits to more parts of the state? So there's lots of practices that could be implemented to answer those questions and achieve those goals. And we're looking to understand from both within state government and outside of state government partners and the public, what are the activities that you want, that you're interested in, that would help mitigate emissions in this space? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the transportation sector is our biggest contributor to climate change in Vermont, but we are already leading the way towards transportation electrification. There's a lot of existing programs that help people better afford electric vehicles, but what about opportunities to incentivize used electric vehicles? Many Vermonters do not purchase brand new cars, they purchase used EVs. So when a consumer goes to buy a car, whether it be new or used, they should be able to understand that choosing an EV can save them money right away and also over the lifetime of a vehicle. But how will they charge their car if they live in a multi-unit dwelling or they rent their home? These are all important questions that we need to address and that could be solved in part by utilizing this funding opportunity. Another opportunity is to reduce emissions from medium and heavy duty trucks or larger trucks that tend to run on diesel and fossil fuel. So for example, a large fleet operator is going to have to consider more than just the purchase price difference between a fossil fuel truck and an electric truck. Should the state have a program that not only makes the price of these vehicles lower, but also helps to train fleet owners and operators and service providers so that they're prepared and have the appropriate infrastructure, tools, and knowledge base to make the transition to electric technology as applied to heavier trucks? Next slide, please. In the building space, there's a lot of money available right now, both at the state and federal level, to make these changes in our building envelopes, to make them more efficient, more weather tight, and be heated with electric heating technologies. So how do we make sure that people can access these programs? How do we make sure that homeowners and renters can avail themselves of these existing resources, whether they're making plan changes to their living space or they're responding to an emergency? I think we're all very aware of the situation that a lot of renters and homeowners were in over the summer and continue to be in now, knowing that they needed to change their heating infrastructure, replace their heating infrastructure, and not necessarily having the tools or resources to understand how to make those choices in an emergency situation from a climate lens. So we need to be better prepared to not only help people make those plan changes, but to respond in an emergency situation by having people who are trained to understand the resources that are available and allow people to access those resources. Also, how do we make sure that we don't run out of money to continue these programs that are already in existence? These programs can make a really big difference in terms of cost savings and emission reductions to homeowners and business owners. So if homeowners and business owners are coming to rely on these resources, how do we make sure that that continues? Next slide, please. So finally, just digging into the solid waste sector. This is a really important sector, but it's also a really complicated one because it has to do with how much we consume and how much we throw away. So how can we help schools, for example, knowing that they don't always have the tools or infrastructure needed to recycle more and compost more? How do we give them that infrastructure and those tools? And then how do we train them to use those tools effectively to reduce the waste that they produce? How can we help entities that manage waste and materials to make changes towards how they process recyclables and waste to reduce emissions or be able to recycle more materials? Also, how do we make sure that the appliances that we use, that when they get thrown away, any harmful, highly potent global warming causing gases aren't emitted in the disposal process? Or even when they're being used, how do we make sure that they're not leaking and not emitting those potent climate warming gases? Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, I want to briefly review, and I'm not going to read all the words on this slide to you, but just briefly review some of the more specific ideas that have bubbled up in these various sectors that we've talked about. And I mentioned some of them as we were going through the slides, but I think it's just helpful for folks to understand that we have identified some specific opportunities, but I think there's a lot of nuance here. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to come up with other ideas that either Vermont could expand upon existing opportunities, or we could find new opportunities to look to mitigate global warming emissions. So for example, I mentioned a program to help support fleet owners that might want to transition to electric trucks via a rebate program that's complemented with some technical support and assistance. Under the buildings and heating sector, helping municipalities that are already availing themselves of these programs that help cities and towns make infrastructure upgrades through a climate lens. How do we make sure that they can meet all of their goals and have enough funding to do that? How do we help to increase recycling and composting across institutions and schools throughout Vermont? How do we give farmers and forest landowners the tools that they need and access to funding to actually reduce and capture emissions from their practices and their land ownership? Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to David for the most important part of the presentation, which is to have some dialogue and hear from you now that we have given you a lot of information about what this funding can be used for and some of the specific opportunities in this space. Thank you.
Megan, thank you so much. And Jane, that's tough to do that in a short amount of time. And those were really helpful presentations. I'm actually going to ask you to go back one slide just for a second, if you don't mind. And folks, I'm interested in any sort of initial reactions that you might have had listening to Megan and Jane talk about this. And let me give you one more piece of context. Jane, Megan, and the team over there, over the next couple months, will be putting together this submission for this funding opportunity. So they'll talk a little bit about next steps going forward, but over the next couple months, they're going to be literally writing this up, saying, this is what we propose to do, and this is what needs to be funded. So this is an opportunity now to help the state think wisely about this. If you could use the chat or just raise your hand in the Zoom, we're very few folks tonight, relatively speaking, so you can even just unmute and say hi. But if any initial quick reactions or questions you have for Megan or Jane, and then I've got a little exercise thing for us to do. But any quick reactions as you were listening to that presentation or questions? Steve, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Very interesting, all your ideas. One thing that popped up for me as you were going through that is the question of whether there's any kind of auditing regarding the solutions proposed in the climate action plan, or if there's a plan for sort of independent third-party auditing of how we're doing with that.
On the full climate action plan?
Full climate action plan, yes.
Yeah. It's a great question, Steve. And I know that Jane's office is working hard on trying to do tracking. Jane, can you say a little bit about Steve's question?
Sure, happy to. Nice to see you, Steve. There's a requirement in the Global Warming Solutions Act that a measuring and assessing progress tool be stood up to measure and track progress, both around climate action broadly and then the specific programs and initiatives proposed in the climate action plan. That is something that our agency is moving forward with developing. In the initial climate action plan, and I can drop this in the chat, it includes a framework for how that would be developed. But as we stood up the first plan, that sort of timing didn't work to do it all at once. And so we actually just closed a request for proposals to develop that tool. And that is for phase 1, which really looks at how we review existing inventory tracking tools that exist or align that would align with climate action, and then think about engagement around what specifically the metrics are that we include in that tool, because it's about emissions reductions, but it's also about how do we measure and track progress around building resilience and adaptation in Vermont? How do we measure and track progress around engagement? And how do we demonstrate that work more broadly around climate action with legislators, with the Vermont public and others? So that's work that is about to really begin in earnest, and likely won't be done for 1 to 2 years from now. But we're looking forward to engaging with Vermonters about what they want us to be tracking and how they would like us to communicate that out to Vermonters.
Great, thanks.
I'm just noticing some stuff in the chat. I'll shout it out just so everybody sees it. Megan says funding for grid system upgrades. What about wastewater? Dana says, what about wastewater systems? They are a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Better incentives for heat pumps, rebates, incentives to help solar energy be a possibility for low income, poverty level Vermonters. Okay. Jason, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to express some appreciation before we get into the exercise for the comprehensiveness and the concreteness of the thinking that's going on that we're being shown here. I'm fairly new to the state, and this is my first time engaging at the state level with climate plans, and it's just really gratifying to see, this comprehensive and concrete thought. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that comment. Yeah. So I'm interested. There's been some activity in the chat, and I'm appreciating that. I wanted to do an exercise that's a little bit more systematic than that. And if Sophie, or I can even do it because you have Sophie's computer, right? I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and we managed to do it. Great. And what that link will do is it'll bring you to a place where you can type in a short phrase or sentence. And I'm encouraging each of you to think about this, right? If you click on that link, it's going to ask you the following question, and it's the one that was on that last slide. What does the state need to hear right now to ensure that this funding will be meaningful? And when I say you, I mean a pretty broad you, right? You and your community, right? So if you want to think about that, I like the topical things that are happening in the chat, and you can add that in here. And if you want to think also like, what would make this particularly meaningful for where I live and the kinds of things that I'm seeing, I'd love to have folks write that up. And what I'll do is I'll start to share my screen with what I see come across so you can see what each other are writing. And then we're actually have an opportunity to even look at each other's stuff and signals the pieces that are meaningful for each other as well. But take a moment, try to answer that question, excuse me. And I'll share my screen as I start to see things come. I'm seeing some stuff come up. Thank you for writing. I'll share it just a second. If anybody's having trouble, just let me know and I can help troubleshoot. So what I'm doing is I'm reading, and I encourage you to do the same if you can see it okay on the screen that I'm sharing. I'm just reading through this because these are very interesting. Is the font big enough for everybody to see on the screen? Yeah. This is great stuff, guys. Thank you. All right. So I've enjoyed looking at this. I see some themes emerging. Maybe you do too. And I allowed you to put in multiple things. So maybe take a pause just for a moment. And I'd love for you, in addition to reading it on the screen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press enter in just a second. And that's going to allow you to go back to that very same screen where you wrote this and pick up to 3 things that are written there that you didn't write, that you really identify with, that you think are really powerful. Let me do a quick caveat. You can call this upvoting, but we're not really voting on anything. And the only reason to do an exercise like where we'll put some checks or some votes on this is just to get a sense of where the energy is in the room. This is not a formal process or any kind of survey process. It's just trying to get a sense of the energy in the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click enter, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen because it won't let you see anymore. But if you go back to your screen now where you had entered in your thing, you'll be able to scroll through everything folks have written, take another minute, read through it, and put some checks or some votes on, I think you have 3 that I assigned. And take a moment to do that. I'll stop sharing my screen because you can't see anything there. Is anybody not seeing on their screen the opportunity to sort of upvote other people's things? Is that working for everybody? Great, thanks. I'll give you a moment. Just read. Feel free to just read calmly. So I'm watching as the number rolls up. I can see on my screen how many people have gotten through and selected, submitted some votes. I'll give it a little bit more time. And my problem is if I show the results, then it stops the voting. So I want to give you the time to select those 3 things that you really identify with. All right, I think we're pretty much there. If you're at the last throes of trying to decide, I would say go ahead and click on those. Great. What do you say we look at it? Take a peek. All right, let me share my screen. Again, I'm caveating this to no end of this is not, scientific. All we're doing is kind of taking a pulse check in this group of people who signed on this evening. Where are you as a group of people? All right, so let's look at what we got. Check this out with me together. Considering housing emissions reductions alongside the housing crisis. State housing construction of low-cost, super sustainable natural building to set a new building standard for our state. People liked that. All right, municipal capacity, right? Technical funding and technical assistance for municipalities. People like that, right? Priorities, actions, and programs that result in tangible quality of life improvements, right? Wonderful. Again, help for municipalities. So some of these are going to be similar, and that's fine, right? There's some similarities around these. Again, other things where there was a lot of enthusiasm, public transportation. And this is interesting. It has a couple things all inside of it. Buyback programs help farmers move from a certain kind of grain system to a grass-based system, right? Limit harvest. So there's three things right all in this one. Again, more for municipality. All right, this is great. So there's lots of enthusiasm for all of these, right? And I'll make sure in the summary that we'll put these all in here too, just as you wrote them. I'd be curious when you all look at this with me, right? And Jane and Megan are looking at this too. What's really jumping out at you? Like thematically, I'd be interested to where people are at. Like, what are you seeing in this? Feel free to raise your hand, just sort of reflect on what you're seeing here. Don't be shy. Burton, go ahead.
Hey, it seems like multiple comments are focused around helping municipalities navigate the transition. It seems like they're a little bit stretched, and it feels like, I'm guessing, I'm not in local government or anything, it seems like they don't have the capacity or the training or the expertise to do this on their own. But every community doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There are all sorts of communities that have already done things. And so really just facilitating known working solutions for communities as they're able to get there seems like a real win.
That's great. And Burton and others, feel free to introduce yourselves too. You can say, like, if there's something you're bringing to this story you want people to know, feel free to introduce yourself. Debbie, go ahead. And I'm going to drop my slides here, but or this screen share here.
I work on community thermal energy networks. So that is definitely my perspective on this. And I'm really struck by how many of these comments have to do with collective action rather than leaving decisions and actions up to individuals. So that's really heartening that we all recognize that to scale and accelerate what we're trying to do, we have to have ways to do this that don't just rely on what people do in their own homes and buildings and cars.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Debbie. And I see some, Maggie and Margot in the chat as well. Really, the emphasis on municipalities has been interesting in this conversation. What else? Keith?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on something that Burton said, how there's a lot of municipalities are doing great things, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for something for municipalities to learn about what other communities have been doing, kind of best practices for municipalities from a climate standpoint. One town may have an amazing section of a climate action plan, and another town may have done something with thermal heating or EVs or whatever. And how do we share that information to make sure that everybody's got the best access to what's going on?
Thanks, Keith. Nice idea. Other thoughts or reactions either to what you saw doing that exercise or anything else you're feeling as you're considering this opportunity for new funding? What else will make this meaningful? Jason?
Thanks. I'll share where I'm coming from. I'm from Montpelier, and I'm a professor of ecological and economic anthropology at St. Michael's College in Colchester.
Nice.
I just wanted to comment on something that I see in that highest comment about addressing the housing crisis with new super sustainable construction. I think there's something that I see in that could be extrapolated thematically, which is to try to use at least some of this funding for what we might call visionary projects, which is to say, I understand that the grant requires us to show immediate emissions reductions, and so much of it may have to be devoted to sort of retrofitting our existing stock of things, like turning over fuel cars to electric cars and weatherizing buildings. But I think something that could make this really meaningful is having at least a few projects where we get to use this huge infusion of cash to demonstrate where we really need to go as a state in the longer term. And I think this kind of housing construction project could do that. I think some kind of, like a couple of the people mentioned, rail projects, like how many people could we get out of their cars on one busy stretch of interstate? You know, like, could we demonstrate a future vision with this huge opportunity?
Thanks, Jason. That's really interesting. That sort of demonstration, visionary work, right? Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jen Durgan. I live in Hartford or White River Junction or whatever you want to call it. I work I volunteer with the Vermont chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan national organization. And a couple members of our group are, I also serve on the climate action team for Hartford. But a couple members of our citizens, it's more than a couple members, but of our citizens climate lobby group in Vermont has really been focusing on regenerative agriculture. So if I would just put in a plug for that, I can describe it more if folks want, but it's really one of the best ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So although I realize it's a smaller sector for Vermont, the agriculture in comparison to transportation. Yeah.
It's still number 3.
Yeah.
And Jen, have you seen in your work or in the organization, you know, certain things that would be particularly valuable to fund within the space of regenerative agriculture and those kinds of practices?
Well, I might refer to Jael. I don't know if she's still on the call because she's a farmer and I know she's been working on the group. But I have a good friend who's an organic farmer in St. Johnsbury, and she didn't really know what it was. And she's an organic farmer, and she and other organic farmers are just really frustrated with having to use the plastic on their crop rows, which is really what they think is the most efficient way to reduce weeds and to reduce labor of weeding. I think some sort of I know there's a technical service provider act at the federal level, and so we've been taking some action, Citizens Climate Lobby, to try to get on a national level to try to get that into the farm bill so that rural farmers in Vermont have more access to technical service providers by allowing other people to become technical service providers. So I saw Jael turned on her screen, so I'll let her chime in.
Yeah, JL, I'll jump right over to you if you have a few things to say on this topic.
Well, full disclosure, I'm also on the Climate Council. I just I lost internet today, so I couldn't join the earlier session for the Climate Council members. And yes, I'm an organic farmer and a huge proponent for organic regenerative agriculture. There's a huge difference, but I did put a comment in the chat or in the survey about switching our agricultural system from growing grain to a grass-based system, because a grass-based system will really help sequester a lot more carbon. And I'm willing to talk to anyone about it. I'm the passion of mine, so feel free to reach out.
Great. Thanks both. I see Chuck has his hands up. Chuck, go ahead, please. And then I'll grab some stuff that's in the chat. There's a lot going on in the chat.
Thanks. The issue that I'm interested in is transportation, especially public transportation. And I'd like to start by mentioning what Jane said, examples with little or no progress. The elephant in the room here on the state level is the Agency of Transportation, which this year had the biggest budget in their entire history. And they give only token amounts to any alternative type of transportation than individual automobile or truck transit. And let me give you some examples of how this impact of tourism is being expressed. Killington just announced they're going to build an additional 200 condos and private homes. And how do people get to Killington? They all have to get there by automobile, except for a small token number that may come through the Rutland Amtrak station. Many of those people come from the east and they come on Interstate 91 or 89. There is no public transit option from Amtrak or anywhere for people to get to Killington. And in terms of EVs, you know, in Woodstock alone, there's 3 petrol stations, but there's only 2 that I know of, public charging stations, which many times are out of service. So people who've come with their EVs are even going to find it challenging to recharge their electric vehicles. But the bottom line is there is no public transit option. If someone arrives on Amtrak in White River or Windsor, there's no public option for them to get to Killington. Now, on the weekends, these mountains, not just Killington, all the mountains, attract tens of thousands of visitors, many, many, many cars. On the weekends, it's just amazing the number of people who just plump up those mountains. I think there has to be some work done with VTrans, and the Agency of Transportation, which has huge amounts of money and are giving absolute token interest to any alternative forms of transit, whether it's public transit that might serve the tourist sector or public transit that serves the rural sector in Vermont. They're doing some demo projects. And no interest at all in alternative transit such as biking, walking, horseback riding, however, alternative ways that people might want to get to some of these recreation areas. So I think that your offices really have to get together with the VTrans people and get them on board with climate change work. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck, for the comment. Jane, it looks like you might want to respond to that comment.
Well, not specifically about VTrans, but I thought it might be helpful in understanding a little bit more about the process to arrive at the measures that we put forward today, and the role of the Climate Action Office in supporting and coordinating with other agencies. So all of the recommendations that came out of the Climate Action Plan have what are lead implementers associated with them. So the state agencies that sort of have jurisdiction around moving them forward. Through that inventory and assessment of progress around the Climate Action Plan, Megan and I, along with our colleagues in the Climate Action Office, work to assign lead implementers to all the actions and then bucket them for review by agencies like our transportation agency. In doing so, they were able to speak to progress as well as complementary programs and ideas such as things like public transit with VTrans, which are primary recommendations in thinking about how we address cutting emissions from our transportation sector. We're just part of robust conversations with VTrans and largely are not included here as specific recommendations because there's a lot of funding coming in through other federal sources right now. So it does not mean that we've done our best job in that space yet, but it does mean that we have an opportunity to continue the conversation with organizations like VTrans to advance the needle in spaces like that. And the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed a few years ago gave wheel to a program called the Carbon Reduction Strategy. And a lot of that money, as well as ARPA dollars and others, are going to public transit and are hopeful to move the needle over the next few years in that space.
Thanks, Jane, for that clarification. I want to know, there's a lot of stuff written in the chat, and I think it's interesting things. I'd welcome folks, if you want to say a little bit more about that than what you're able to write in the chat. I'm seeing transportation ideas about sort of lead by example with state trooper vehicles on EVs and with other law enforcement as a lead by example opportunity. I'm looking at the affordable housing piece here. Affordable housing organizations and private developers are also making energy decisions for many people at once, not just municipalities. So they need good information and support. So focusing on affordable housing organizations as a target of doing this work. Thermal energy coaching. Keith says in there, Maggie's got a long thing. I haven't had a chance to read this yet, Maggie. I'm just looking at this. And if there's anything else, Maggie, you want to say about this, that it became clear the building would need a complete overhaul to even make any of the energy saving suggestions meaningful. So basically what you're saying is it takes a lot of money to do this, if I think is what your point. Is that right, Maggie?
Yeah, so as part of my job as a regional planner, I'm helping the municipalities with the Municipal Energy Resilience Program. So I've attended a couple of what's called level 2 assessments. And those do like a blower door test and take a really deep dive into the structure of the building and where exactly the energy is being lost and how to, the contractors propose solutions to address that. And for both the Rutland City Rec Center and the Fairhaven Town Hall, basically what the contractor said was that the buildings were constructed in such a funky way that they would need to like really dig into like the kind of like the outside layers of the building, I guess, to figure out what was going on. And that alone would cost 5-6 figures, let alone trying to implement anything else. So, yeah, I mean, the interest in the MERP program too has been very, very huge. I'm honestly very impressed by the fact that we've had almost every town sign up to at least get assessments, which shows that there's very high interest in the program. And what I mentioned in my comments about how municipal buildings are the second highest source of emissions just behind transportation, there's big value to be captured there. And I think that the state would be remiss if we didn't try to build upon well, we don't have tangible outcomes yet from MERP. We're still in the middle of assessments, but if we could just build upon that somehow, I think that would help fill a great need within the state.
Thanks, Maggie. That's great. And yeah, we see, I'm just looking at the chat as well. Yeah, funding. There's always opportunities for putting money to work. Ask Bill McKibben. Yes. I think Bill was involved at one point in the early days of the Climate Council. All right. So we've been encouraging you to think about, in particular, like the areas where Megan provided some orientation, like natural and working lands, the transportation, right? The heating, the buildings, and waste, right? Those were the ones that Megan put out there. I'd be curious, is there something that hasn't been put on the table that really should be, because it would meet this criteria for the federal funding, and it just seems like a really good opportunity for Vermont? Is there anything that we haven't spoken about yet that maybe even stretches outside of those 4 buckets that we should be putting on the table tonight? Jennifer, go ahead. Or Jen. Hang on one second, Jen, you're still on mute.
Sorry, I've been a little perplexed at the lack of emphasis on hybrids because, they don't require those huge batteries, and I know some people that have like a RAV Prime hybrid plug-in, and they're able to, just through the braking power, they're able to go weeks and weeks without ever filling up their gas tank. And there's so much concern about EVs and the minerals it's going to take to build those big batteries that I know the federal legislation didn't focus on hybrids, but I don't know. That's my statement.
Thanks, Jen. And Megan is the perfect person to provide some clarity on that, because she knows these inside and out. Megan, what does the state do now on hybrids, and what are you thinking for any of these additional federal dollars?
Sure. So you're right, Jen, that the emphasis of late at both the state and the federal level has been more on the battery electric vehicles versus the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle technology. And I would agree with you that there are many cases where folks that have the hybrid vehicles are able to operate them in such a way that they hardly ever, if at all, need to fill up their gas tanks, because their normal driving habits only really encompass the range of the hybrid vehicle. The average mileage that a Vermonter travels in a typical day is less than 50 miles. And so the plug-in range of some of these hybrids is more than adequate to achieve that average driving range. Unfortunately, we do also see a lot of use cases where folks just don't use the battery component of the hybrid vehicle, and they rely more primarily on the internal combustion engine component of the vehicle. And that can often overshadow the benefits of the battery portion of the hybrid technology. And so that's why I think the focus has been towards more of the battery electric technology being adopted and encouraging more uptake of that technology, because of the other side of the hybrid technology, where folks just don't take as much of advantage of the battery technology as we would expect that they might. I'll also just briefly dive into, the conversation about life cycle emissions of electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines. It's obviously a complicated question to answer because it's very dependent on the type of vehicle, and the amount of energy that goes into manufacturing that vehicle, and the battery technology that you spoke of, which is incredibly complex given the minerals that we need to find more of to facilitate, that battery technology. But most of the scenarios that we look at in terms of deployment of battery electric vehicles in Vermont and the life cycle emissions of those vehicles, it works out really well in Vermont because our electricity mix is very clean relative to other states. So even when you factor in those kind of beginning of life intense energy components of electric vehicles, at the end of an EV's useful life, which can actually be sometimes longer than an internal combustion engine, depending on the overall health of the battery through its lifetime, the emissions are significantly lower from a life cycle perspective. And that's what we really find time and time again when we look at different types of vehicles. And so that is why we're putting more of our eggs in the BEV basket versus the hybrid technology basket at this point. So I hope that helps to answer your question, but I'm happy to follow up offline as well with more information and continue the conversation. But I will say that we're not, discounting hybrid technology as helping with this transition. It is incentivized in many different respects in Vermont and federally. So I definitely agree that it's an important component to the transition, but just maybe why it's not as heavily emphasized as transitioning to the full battery technology. But thank you for the question. It's a really important one.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to jump to Dana and then back to Chuck, if that's okay. Dana, go ahead.
Yeah, so Dana Clausen, Town of Hartford. I made the comment earlier about the wastewater plants because last year I did a UNH climate assessment or greenhouse gas assessment for the town of Hartford. And I was just shocked by our greenhouse gas coming from our wastewater. So I was wondering if there's any exploration into catching those emissions and turning them into electricity or anything of that nature, if anybody's considered anything like that, because it's next to buildings and transportation, it's probably municipalities, biggest source of emissions.
Megan or Jane, specifically on the issue of wastewater plants and emissions, any thoughts there? In addition to, thanks for the comment, but is there some thinking you guys have done on that?
Yeah, so addressing emissions from wastewater treatment facilities was actually a recommendation of the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan. And it's a particular area that we've worked really closely with our folks in our watershed management division that oversee wastewater treatment facilities. Most of those facilities do actually have flaring operations, which helps to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from those operations. And in some cases are actually required within the permits that are issued to those facilities to allow them to operate. So in many cases, it's actually an issue of giving folks that operate those plants the resources that they need to keep those flares operational. And then in instances where they don't exist, helping to get that infrastructure up and running. And so we are definitely considering that as a component or as an effective and significant use of this funding, and working really closely with folks within ANR to determine how to do that. So thank you for that comment.
Super. Thanks, Dana, and thanks, Megan. Chuck, back to you.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to bring up something I don't think I've heard mentioned, and that is workforce training. We can throw all the money in the world at these different programs, but if we don't have anyone to actually do the work, then we're never going to get there. And I wanted to say that an example is these are excellent jobs, by the way, for young people to consider, including women. These are jobs that are open to women. And an excellent partner is Vermont Works for Women, which has a program called Trailblazers. We graduated 15 young women in White River back in August in various electrical and solar heat pumps and weatherization. And we would like to do more, but Vermont Works only has capacity to run about 4 of these a year all across the state. They need more assistance to open additional training opportunities across the state. But I tell you, these workforce training is not only good for the environment, it's great for kids who just don't want to spend themselves silly going to college and then, you know, end up driving a taxi or whatever they end up doing. So I would hope that workforce training could be also on the agenda, and considering our 2 trainers in Vermont, Vermont Works for Women and Vermont Adult Learning, which are doing excellent work given the constraints that they have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chuck. And I'm wondering, Jane, is workforce training something that would fit under this particular funding piece, or does it fit under some other funding piece?
There's a large component of workforce training that fits into what the initial pot of money around the climate pollution reduction grant, which is the climate planning grant. So the work that we're doing now in service of lifting up these actions to make us eligible for the federal funding opportunity is funded actually through a smaller pot in that same grant, which is a $3 million planning grant that our office got to support this collaboration with all of you and this work. And we, in that, those deliverables, those components of the work in taking that funding, we have an obligation to be thinking about workforce development and what our state's doing around climate workforce. And there are some great opportunities coming down the pike that Megan and I are collaborating on with our office, with other offices across state government, one of which has been the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is run out of Department of Children's and Families, actually got a grant through the Department of Energy to develop a workforce training center at Vermont technical colleges around climate jobs specifically. And so we're thinking about that, how we can further that. And the program that you spoke to specifically, Chuck, we are meeting with the woman who's the executive director, Kate, I'm forgetting her last name, for Learn, Serve, and Earn. And that is a workforce collaboration through state government that speaks specifically to the women's workforce opportunity that you just spoke to, Chuck, as well as Vermont Youth Conservation Corps and 4 other opportunities specifically. And they have a big emphasis now on climate jobs in particular. And we'll be meeting with them specifically to think about how we can funnel funds as well as support partnership with them to advance climate opportunities in the programming that they offer.
Nice. Great. So it's good to hear it coming out tonight and know that there's some stuff going on and there's enthusiasm to do more. And I saw Steve's comment about thinking about from a small business standpoint, in addition to the workforce training standpoint. Okay. There's a number of things in the chat, I think, that I may have missed. I'll just apologize for that. I see compliance and interest in looking at compliance, and that kicked off a bunch of back and forth. What else? Is there anything else before we finish up tonight? Things that folks want to say? I know Jane has a slide or 2 left. It talks about next steps and what to expect. But before we go there, are there other things that folks want to mention that would be helpful in shaping the thinking of the state? Anything else? Burton, go ahead.
Hey, me again. I was going to say one thing that just happened in Burlington is the city council recently approved a program where the McNeil power generation facility, which burns leftover wood and is possibly the single largest carbon emitter in the state. I forget where it actually stands in the rankings. it emits a lot of carbon, but by way of some loopholes, they count it as renewable because it comes from trees. We can leave it aside, but it's an example of a problem that I keep seeing coming up, which is committing to changes that really lock in emissions for like a period of time. So this McNeil deal, it's like 20 years, by which time the globe will be boiling. And I would say like trying to identify opportunities now that would prevent like locking in emissions. So home weatherization and heat pump programs are a good example of that at like the home level. This McNeil thing, okay, we can set it aside, but that's an example at like the electrical generation level. And just maybe trying to find and forestall some notable examples of that going forward, and using funding to basically say, all right, it's going to cost a little more upfront to do the right thing, but in return, we're not going to get stuck with this bad decision for the next 10, 20, 30 years. I don't have any specific examples of that, but it's like a thing to watch out for. I'm sure it comes up all the time. And this McNeil thing was just like last week in Burlington, but I'm sure it's happening all over the state.
Thanks, Burton. Right. So using the funding to avoid locking yourself into decisions that then have multi-decades of implications. Nice. Okay. Anything else, folks? I see we're losing folks. I'm hoping my kids are making dinner for me. Maybe something similar is happening with you. Anything else before we wrap up? Megan, you
David,
kick off.
I just wanted to offer, I don't think we responded to a lot of the comments related to municipal action and support needed for the new levels of municipal action related to climate. And I'll just say, we mentioned this in our presentation, but that is definitely an area that we're focusing on, and with a particular focus to utilizing and capitalizing on existing pathways for municipal support, so that we're not creating another kind of avenue that municipalities have to go down to get the support that they need to meet their climate mitigation goals. And so we've been talking with the Department of Building and General Services, which is the entity that's implementing the Municipal Energy Resilience Program that was mentioned a number of times. And we've been also talking with regional planning commissions that are helping their municipalities via the Municipal Training and Assistance Program, or excuse me, Municipal Technical Assistance Program, which is a newer initiative that is meant to help build capacity for municipalities that don't have a lot of ability to address, to meet their goals, whether it's from a climate perspective or otherwise. So those are two existing programs that we are looking to utilize to use this funding opportunity to have more resources flow into those existing programs to further assist municipalities in meeting their goals in those programs. Because we also obviously have heard that the programs like the MERP program are really oversubscribed, which signals that municipalities are really interested in making these improvements and are putting a lot of capacity and resources into doing that. And so we feel like we should meet those municipalities where they are in their ambition and help them meet those goals. So I mentioned that, but I also just want to say, if there's folks on the call that have other ideas of existing programs and opportunities that municipalities are engaged in currently that we could utilize to, again, not create another avenue that municipalities have to go down to meet their goals, but can tap into existing resources and structure, that would be really helpful for us to understand. And we'd really welcome those comments in writing, or give us a phone call or drop us an email. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And if folks don't have the contact information, maybe Sophie can drop it in the chat now. Yeah, there it is right there. There's some contact information that Sophie's dropping in for the Climate Action Office. And that's the best way to reach Jane, Megan, Sophie, those folks. I wonder, since we're starting to lose folks rather rapidly, and I really appreciate the words of support in the chat. Jane, do you want to say a word about next steps? I think you have a slide as well, don't you?
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and really thank you everybody for being here tonight and all the comments and suggestions. It was really more than we could have hoped for, and appreciate any follow-up that you have to offer. So this is the start really of a conversation around this. We have another one of these tomorrow at lunch, but we really plan to continue engagement with Vermonters throughout the winter as we move from this sort of planning phase into the development of the implementation grant, which is due April 1st, so right behind that sort of preliminary plan that's due the month previous. So we will continue to engage, look for specific opportunities throughout the winter around the sectors that we're trying to lift up specific actions around. So how do we go out and meet farmers where they are, forest landowners, homeowners throughout the state, and think about piggybacking on opportunities that folks are joining on already. And then we'll have a plan with the final suite of actions for input during the month of February. If you reach out to us or through registration have provided us your email, we'll be sure to share with you an opportunity to comment on it and provide us any further feedback. But we're looking forward. This is a long-term process. The funds will hopefully be awarded to Vermont next fall, as well as we'll have a 5-year horizon to think about how we roll this out. So thank you all for being with us tonight. Again, I'll go to the final slide, which really is that contact information, which I know Sophie's put in the chat for all of you too, but really welcome hearing from all of you and look forward to future opportunities to hear feedback from you along the way.
Super. All right, folks. Well, I think that's where we'll end it tonight. Do be in touch, and really appreciate the thoughtful discussion and ideas that came in by the chat and everywhere. We'll be doing summaries of this one and tomorrow's. So look for those, and we may push them out to you just to make sure we're capturing this correctly. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Hope you grab some dinner. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
That was